All right, everybody. Welcome back to the greatest podcast in the world. If you're an independent thinker who's based on the internet, and that's all. I think that's pretty much becoming my main shtick. Thank you for coming out, as always. Today we are going to be experimenting with a new format, which I have thought about very, very carefully. There are tons of interesting people kind of who I'm connected to or who I've become acquainted with who have really interesting ideas that I want to kind of give a platform to. But because there's so many of them and you never really quite know until you're talking with someone what it's going to be like, I've decided to institute a new format that really focuses on efficiency. I want to be able to share with you all kind of the most interesting, sometimes weird, different independent thinkers out there. But I want to kind of force myself to kind of cut to the chase a little bit more quickly. So what I'm going to try to do is with this template is I'm going to make them much shorter. So I'm going to aim for around 30 minutes, let's say maybe 45 minutes max. And I'm going to try to introduce you to just weird, interesting, smart, fascinating people who have ideas to share, have work to share. And I'm going to use this kind of format that I've designed and that I'll continue to iterate on to pretty much try to share with you their main ideas and kind of extract from them whatever is most interesting or valuable that I think people should hear about, and to try to do it in the most concentrated way possible. I know a lot of my podcasts over the past year or so have just been like really long and meandering. And I've thought a lot about this, and I've decided I'm going to make a concerted effort to share more interesting thinkers in a much more concise and efficient way. So a young man named Alexander is going to be one of my first guinea pigs for this new format. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Alexander in Raleigh, North Carolina, when I passed through earlier in the year. He's very smart, very interesting, very unique young man, and he's got a lot of interesting ideas. So he recently posted a blog post that he thought was particularly worth sharing. And I said, hey, it'd be a great opportunity to come jump on the show, and let's try this new format that I'm trying to introduce. I'm calling it the sidebar. So I'm going to bring on Alexander in just one moment, and we'll have a nice conversation with him. Before we get started, just only a few points of housekeeping. I have nothing to shill at the moment. Although I actually have something free and cool to offer people if they're interested. One thing I'm doing is I'm hosting work sessions. So if any of you are working on like creative or intellectual projects, maybe you have a hard time focusing or you're procrastinating or whatever, it's kind of, your head can get kind of crazy in the pandemic, lockdown in your house situation. On Tuesday mornings, you can come hang out with me and my friends and people I know, and work on writing projects or whatever you're working on. Work on some private personal project, but on a group Zoom call. It sounds kind of weird, but pretty much it's just a way to force yourself to be focused and productive. We do it for 4-hour sessions on Tuesday mornings. And we do like focused work sprints for like 45 minutes. Then we take a break for 10 minutes. And in the breaks, we chat, shoot the breeze. It's kind of interesting. It's all like interesting, cool people doing cool projects. So if you're working on any kind of creative or intellectual project, you should come hang out, get a focused 4-hour session done. And it's just a good way to kind of increase your productivity and also hang out with other interesting, creative, intellectual people in my orbits. So that's on Tuesday mornings. There's a link in the description below. You just have to register. It's totally free. There's no shilling there. And as always, I just like to start these by saying a huge thanks to my patrons. Super grateful for my patrons. I could not be doing all the stuff that I'm doing if it wasn't for my patrons. So for those of you out there who are throwing me some money each month, I'm very grateful. Thank you. And that's about it. So that's the game plan. I think I'm going to now bring on Mr. Alexander, and we're going to talk about complexity in computing. So here we go. Alexander, you're now on the live stream with me. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing just fine. How about yourself?
I'm good. It's nice to see you again, Alexander.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. So, you want to just jump right into it?
Absolutely. Why don't you start off by just telling us, if you had to you have lots of interesting ideas going through your blog. You can see you've been writing about many different things for quite some time. But in your view, what is perhaps kind of your big idea at the moment anyway?
So just going off of my notes here, the main thing, as far as I understand, is computers are quite literally obscenely complicated. And this poses a lot of limitations and challenges that we have, and in terms of the way we can use stuff. Whoops, sorry, wrong page. There's a quote that I have from Peter Welch, and he's another blogger, but he's more of more of an industry programmer, more employable, if you will. And he once said that no one actually understands how everything in your 5-year-old netbook actually works. When you take your computer to go get it fixed or get it repaired, what the technician's really doing is kind of invoking a built-in team of automatic doctors to try and fix it. It doesn't really, work like that. I also had another pretty interesting quote. There's this programmer I follow. Their username is Evie on Twitter. And they said, computers have advanced so far. Now the printers don't work on Windows either, kind of like a tongue-in-cheek sort of thing. And, I kind of carried that on. And I said, yeah, but the Game Boy printer still works for the Game Boy, so maybe we should go back to basics. And, I was kind of joking at the time as a bit of a self-deprecating, but, in all honesty, that's unironically the idea. I've been doing a lot of work with the Game Boy Advance. because it's a simple console, all the way down to the bare metal and the signals and the ones and zeros that are in the thing. It's very simple, and a single person can understand it. So that's why I've been working with that lately.
So am I right in understanding that you're kind of trying to make a kind of call to arms to make all of computing much simpler because you think it could be and should be?
Yeah, basically. I've also been trying to answer a lot of the difficult questions about like how are people going to want to buy that, because all the computers that we have right now are, pretty complicated, and they have all the, existing money and resources. They already have everybody's attention. So that's going to be something I can get into a little bit more later as well. But that's the main idea pretty much.
Are there other examples of successful simplicity in computing other than the Game Boy that you mentioned? Are there other kind of paradigmatic examples in your mind?
Yeah, definitely. One of the best examples I can come up with is MS DOS, PC DOS. The thing that's very interesting about the simplicity in computing is that our own retrospective is kind of just biased it a little bit to where we appreciate old computers for what they were and not for what they could have been, which makes sense because we don't use old computers anymore. But in truth, the DOS had a lot of potential and a lot of ability, technically speaking. Like, there was a lot of video games for it, a lot of high bit, high color depth, fast frame rates. It was capable of a lot if that's what you really wanted it to be doing. I actually had a quote for years that I used to say is that Microsoft Word never really needed to have more than 16 colors, which was, the amount of colors that it started out with back in the 16-bit days with Word 6.0. On Windows 3.1, you only had 16 colors, and it's kind of funny that I've ended up, arriving at this conclusion with the thesis and everything, because I literally believe that. I think that it's a word processor. If you want to put an image into a document, I mean, sure, it could print fine, but you really, it's not about pictures. It's about writing words. You've got 16 colors. Surely that's enough for highlighting and, stuff like that, and hyperlinks and everything. It really never did. Like, okay, maybe for PowerPoint might need more colors, but that's what it is. You just take things for what they are in terms of the technical capabilities.
So why in your diagnosis are so many computers so unnecessarily complex?
Well, I think it's just because, software has gotten a free ride in terms of complexity. We've had every kind of economic incentive to write bad code because, it'll just ship anyways, and everyone is just going to have to deal with it because that was the default. That was made the norm. And so, with the explosive power of computing, CPUs just getting so fast, and the advent of graphics processors and stuff like that, you could just write millions and millions of lines of code. You could just let the complexity explode, and the silicon was paying for it. Now, not so much the silicon's, starting to not quite pay for it the way it used to. I mean, it still kind of is, but it still begs other questions in terms of like I wrote in my essay that things are kind of approaching this big singularity of, mega tablets and magic tablets and big screens. It's kind of like how things look on the USS Enterprise and Star Trek. It's very, I think it would be, personally, I think it's pretty imaginatively bankrupt. But it really doesn't bother me any more than the fact that it seems like we're not given a choice about this. We can't have computers be another way. The iPhone has to become thinner and thinner because Apple finds that that's what's best. And disagreeing with them in the market is not very realistic. It costs too much to experiment. So, that's kind of the thing with that.
Interesting. Now, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself personally and your intellectual trajectory? Tell us a little bit about what was kind of the background that led up to this particular kind of intellectual fascination you have with this critique of complexity. Right.
So ever since I could remember, I've always been pretty fascinated by computers. My father would recall, he said when I was 2 years old, I, would go around and I would be asking people questions like, what operating system were you running? I was very curious and very fascinated. But by the time I got into adolescence and I was about maybe 12 years old, I started to take programming seriously because I tried and failed to clone. I wanted to use IBM batch script to make my own command line word processor. I wanted to clone WordPerfect because I saw that program on an old laptop that I had. And I said, hey, well, why don't I just make my own? That should be a project. I can try doing that. It didn't work because it's batch script, but that's when I discovered BASIC. And over that next few years, I had that kind of teenage brain plasticity. And I just learned all kinds of stuff. All the information was there because, of course, all the programmers left it there. They're the ones who made all these systems. They left all the documentation online for each other. And anything that wasn't in documentation or was just common knowledge, so to speak, well, they were all on IRC. I could talk to them, and that's what I did. And I learned.
And what kind of, so IRC, what other kind of like community, what internet communities really are you kind of embedded in at this time?
I'm not really into many communities much anymore because I think that I kind of just grew out of that in terms of like the social capacity. A lot of those people aren't really the best when it comes to talking with others. But when I was 15, I could really just care less. I could put up with that. It didn't matter. But most of it is just going to be IRC channels and mailing lists and stuff like that. It really couldn't have been more loose knit. It couldn't have been more voluntary.
And what about right now? How would you describe like your internet sociological milieu?
Well, it's mostly on Twitter these days, but I will admit that that's probably, for just lack of a better, I guess recourse, if you will. I do spend a lot of time on Discord as well, but I don't talk too much. I'm mostly just hanging out with my old college friends and things like that and keeping up with the, what I'm doing on Arqadium and stuff like that, syndicating. But that's mostly it.
Okay, cool. And do you want to say anything more about your current projects, more practically, like with Arqadium? You're the president of this. It's a software business. It's a game design business. Is that right? Or do you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, it's kind of both. I came up with a really succinct description for it this year. A few months ago, I call it a duplex of entertainment and software. I'm really good with the software side of things, but my husband Aldi, I work with him as well, and he's the other half of the company, and he's really good when it comes to more of the product side of things, which I don't talk about as much. I don't do as much, but he's good at marketing and sales because that's what his family did. So that's kind of the things with that. As far as recent projects go, the main game plan here, besides just promoting the thesis and getting the whole idea out, is to make the video games and try to make more of a name for myself by finishing a product. It's not really easy to get a video game out. A lot of people try. So the bar is pretty low. If you can get something out, chances are people will give it a second look, that kind of thing.
So you're trying to get your first one out. You haven't done one yet.
Yeah, because I've been doing a lot of experimentation, with how am I going to go about computing? How am I going to choose to do this? A few months ago, I was writing a lot of really succinct kind of, bare bones C code that was meant to be like cross-platform on Unix, and I could target Windows. But I realized that, even these underlying platforms like Mac OS and Linux and stuff like that were just more complicated than what it was worth for what I wanted to accomplish, and I realized it was going to get in my way, in the same way that using Unity or GameMaker does. I'm going to run into problems that I don't have the power to solve, and I don't want to do that. Call me stubborn, if you will, but that's kind of how I arrived at, these conclusions about complexity. So now that I know the answer, I'm like, great, okay, I can just work on the Game Boy. I already know how to do that, I studied that for a while when I was 17, so that's where I got to go from here.
Cool. So I think there are a lot of people in my audience who are into game development or they're into software engineering, but they're kind of like maybe a few steps behind you. In other words, people who are kind of aspiring to do the types of things that you're actively working on now. So I'm curious, do you have any kind of lessons learned or any kind of, observations about trying to pursue the projects that you're pursuing that you might want to share with other people trying to do this sort of thing also?
I would say that here's the thing, is that the game dev industry is very, very unique. And, it does have a lot of room for like criticisms and, competencies. It's like inside and out. I couldn't call it anything but controversial. And of course I say that lovingly because, I work in it and I understand it. But it's a very good place to be if you are doing it for the right reasons. And that's actually what's kind of great, is that most people who are here are not just here for the money, because, well, the money is actually in Silicon Valley, not here. So as far as like people who are practicing goes, it's going to be a lot of the similar advice, from Valve. They say, just keep iterating, make something that sucks and then make it better, things like that. But something that's more along the same vein as what I'm talking about with complexity of computing is something that it was a talk that Jonathan Blow gave at a games conference in Russia, and it's titled "Preventing the Collapse of Civilization." So I'm definitely not the only kind of games programmer that's going into this sort of political vein about things, but I do think that I'm putting a lot more effort forth into making this competent, so that in the actual political sense, this thing can kind of stand on its own two legs and it can go somewhere and it could reach critical mass. Like, I don't think that Jonathan Blow is thinking on that level, but that's okay. He's got the right idea as well. There's a lot to say about that.
Right. Well, I think I suspect that a lot of people can sympathize with your attack on unnecessary complexity, because in a lot of ways, like, our everyday devices are often inundated with different features that we don't really use, and they actually end up getting in the way for us. So I wonder, for someone like you who's been thinking quite hard about unnecessary complexity in computing, do you have any tips or tricks on the practical front, on the kind of on the front of how we actually do things like write a blog? Like, you have a website, you have an active blog. These types of personal computing things that people like me and my audience are interested in. Are there any tips or tricks you've learned about how to kind of remove unnecessary complexity in clever ways?
So the way that I think about it is, and this is, I know you're asking probably more from the end user perspective, and there is good things to say from that end as well. One of the things that I do that makes my smartphone experience a lot saner is I installed Lineage OS. So I was, the reason for staying on Lineage for me is less about the principles of freedom or avoiding of Google and things like that. It's
so I've never heard of that. So is that hard
Lineage?
is it hard to hack that with an iPhone? Can you put that on an iPhone or what?
No, it's a fork of Android that doesn't have Google.
Okay.
That's what it is. Yeah. So the main reason I stay with Lineage is mostly because of the difference in notifications. It has this feature called Notification Guard, and it sandboxes your applications a lot better than stock Android ever tries to do, because it doesn't really try to do that. Google doesn't want that. They want all the data to go every which way, But in Lineage, things get sandboxed, and when you don't want to hear notifications from an app, you don't hear notifications from an app. Period. End of story. It's your device. I guess it's just those lack of perverse corporate incentives makes it end up being a better experience, So, there's things from that. I'd say more on the blogging kind of aspect of things. I program my website myself, but it's still a static website and it's not complicated. But I think that there are a lot of really good solutions out there that a lot of you guys are finding. I've seen things just well and beyond WordPress. Everyone's really kind of growing out of WordPress, and I like to see that, because, oh God, man, WordPress is really complicated under the hood. It's a lot of really bad, PHP and stuff.
Yeah, and they recently introduced all these major changes, the Gutenberg kind of direction, and there's this huge divide now in the WordPress community. A lot of people don't like it, and it's actually probably a good case in point of unnecessary complexity, perhaps. We're starting to get some questions, which actually dovetail with some of the questions that you and I, Alexander, talked about when we were kind of preparing for this, which is, pretty much the question of, like, Noah Watson, for instance, here is asking, why have all these companies made their code overly complicated? Surely that would be less efficient. So are they just incompetent? Another way of phrasing this is that it would seem like if there's all this complexity in computing, it's probably because of deep underlying kind of market forces, right? So one could argue that, is it not inescapable? All this complexity that we see, is it not arguably precisely the amount of complexity that's necessary given the contemporary market reality? So what do you say to that?
So I say that it's definitely escapable, and the result that we have in the first place is a result of two things happening. There's going to be a manager, or a producer in film parlance, someone who's in charge of the product, and they're just going to get it out. And then there's going to be the programmer, or the scientist, the technical. And so what happens is that by default, us tech guys, us technical programmer people, we like technology, we're passionate about it. And so, when we're doing, experimentation and discovering things and figuring out new ways to do things, we're very impassioned and passionate about that stuff, and we like it. So, like, for example, with the invention of BetterFS, for example, this state-of-the-art file system that's supposed to be really, really good for Linux, us technical guys are really going to like that stuff. It's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting. We're going to put it into production. We're going to make it work, right? but on the corporate side and the product side, things like that still happen. And then ultimately the producer's not going to object to it because either they don't understand or, are you there?
Yeah, I just put you on the solo feature mode.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Yeah, but it's this sort of thing to where product managers are not going to object to the complexity because they don't understand it and they don't see the issue because it works or it appears to work to them.
I see.
In reality, there's more complexity in the product. People weren't asking for that. The truth is that your life would be made a lot easier if you had a simpler file system because there would be less that can go wrong. For example,
Good.
Yeah. For example, the one of the original file systems that you have for Linux is ext2, and it's really old. It was designed in the 90s, and one of those things about X2 is that it's very simplistic and it doesn't have this feature called journaling. And why would you want something like journaling? Well, it's just a more efficient algorithm, if you will, for storing and accessing files. But the truth about journaling is that it has some implications. Like, for example, if you permanently delete a file, it could still be lingering around in your file system. Like if you were to try to shred it, it's not just going to be gone necessarily. So there's kind of like a gotcha, kind of like what we see with solid state drives, how you can't just wipe the zeros. There's going to be parts of it that you just can't access. That's what's happening on a file system level with more advanced journaling file systems. And in most cases, end users are not going to need journaling because, they're not running things that are very complicated. In reality, they end up inadvertently needing journaling simply because of very overcomplicated code that some developer lazily strewn together and sent out to product is saving tens of thousands of files, like a standard operating procedure with JavaScript, for example. Your node modules folder, 20,000 files is normal. That's going to be really slow on X2. So instead of us, so basically what we have here is that tens of thousands of JavaScript files is really slow. What are we going to do? The sane solution would be to stop doing it that way. Stop saving everything as its own file, but instead we've got this Galaxy Brain solution of, I'm going to make my file system more able to cope with my insane development tendencies. That's kind of like what's happening there.
Okay. Interesting. So it's kind of a combination of bureaucratic conflicts and then just sort of runaway path dependent.
Yeah. We can afford it.
Solutions to those earlier kind of bureaucratic compromises. Right. So if you're right, then is it not implied also that there should be a kind of arbitrage opportunity here, right? If you're right,
exactly,
there should be this gap in the market, right? Where people could be creating much simpler tools, much simpler computing. And according to your perspective, there should be demand for this. You think it's just not being met?
I think that the demand is the same kind of demand that has always been there, and that's probably what's been misunderstood. At the end of the day, what is a laptop to a grandma? It's probably being able to watch YouTube and Netflix or check your messages. It's really not a whole lot of things that she expects. But the truth is that most people don't have, they don't expect the whole world out of their devices, and it's even expressed like in the tablet form. We expect certain things out of a tablet, like, oh, I want to be able to draw on this. I want to make pictures, it's really not that complicated. But the reason that this hasn't been tapped into as much is because the barrier to entry is individually very high. In order for someone to be able to be competent enough to actually break through the membrane here and then reach critical mass, they have to be as competent in programming as they are in management. And most people aren't like that. Most programmers are not going to have leadership qualities. In fact, they're going to have the opposite. They're going to be hard to manage on average, all things considered. And managers are mostly, a lot of times like managers in big, Fortune 500 companies and big tech companies, they're just retired programmers. They're like, yeah, I'm done writing JavaScript. Now I get to make six figures and tell other people to write JavaScript, and they don't really care,
Okay. So it sounds like you kind of think the key to solving this is putting together teams that have the right unique combination of personality traits.
I think it's going to take the right person. And that's interesting that you brought up teams, because that ties into another really good point that I want to make is that, the way that it has to work when you have hardware and software that is kept as simple as possible is ideally you need to be able to have it simple enough to where one person can wrap their head around it and understand it inside and out. Or if you've got like, for example, like, because right now I'm starting with just what's available to me, which is stuff like the Game Boy Advance and MS-DOS and stuff like that. But say maybe in the future there was a purpose-built platform or console, if you will, that would do have modern features like being able to connect to the internet as we do it today and display millions of colors and things like that. Maybe I want to have this console do dedicated 3D, but 3D is something that's kind of complicated. So what I'm going to do on my product development is I'm going to hire a dedicated 3D developer, and they're going to develop all the 3D hardware, and they're going to understand everything about that. I'm just going to be the general systems programmer. And likewise with networking, for example, say I want to make an MMO, I should probably hire a dedicated network engineer. And if this is going to have complicated network hardware, likewise for this. So it goes like on both ends, whether I'm the consumer, I'm the game developer, or I'm even making the hardware, you got to have like a one-to-one relationship. So, but at the same time, it still has to be pragmatic. So if I'm going to just make a game that does something really simple, like uploading high scores to a leaderboard, I shouldn't be hiring a dedicated network programmer for that. It should be simple enough to where I'm going to just be okay. So that's kind of how it works. You could have like 1, 2, or 3 people. So in effect, this is going to be vastly cheaper to be able to hire. The hard part is just finding the right people. But once you do, and they get very well paid. And that's just more versatile. Your teams can be organized a lot more, easily. There's no middle management. There's really no bureaucracy at all. And you can put together something amazing, because that's how they did it originally back in the day. Ken Thompson, he said once that, I don't know how I realized it, but one day I realized that I had an operating system in 3 weeks. He says he needs to make 3 parts. He has to make an assembler. He has to make an editor for him to write the code, and he has to make a little kernel of sorts to talk to the hardware, and luck had it that his wife and kids went away for vacation for 3 weeks, and then he had Unix. That's kind of what happened. And my job here is to demonstrate that that's economically viable, because it always has been. It's just not what we've been doing.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting project. So, one might point to examples that already exist, right? You can find some relatively simple computing devices out there, but they don't seem to be very popular. Like you can get smartphones that have a lot of the functionality of an iPhone for about $150. They do exist, but no one buys them. So it does seem to be that there's some kind of hurdle. There's some, even if you're right, Alexander, there seems to be something kind of blocking mass adoption of simpler computing technologies. Do you have like a diagnosis of that, or what do you think?
Yeah.
How do you get over that hurdle? How do you get over that?
It's real simple. All the existing product niches have already been filled. It's kind of like the catch-22 of Mastodon or a lot of those attempted YouTube killer apps. People aren't going to flock over simply because you say something like, hey, we're not YouTube. We're not going to do those shitty things that you heard about. We're not going to censor or whatever. It's not a good enough reason to drive mass adoption. It's not enough of a niche by itself to sustain itself. Mm-hmm. And so the reason we don't see smartphones that come about simply because they're simpler is because at the end of the day, the iPhone or even a cheap Android is going to have a lot for what people are looking at. So, you have to get creative in terms of carving out your product niche, and you really have to kind of go market to market and go head to head in the business and figuring out, hey, I'm going to make something that doesn't quite exist before, and that's what we're trying to do. Okay.
Fascinating. So I think we just covered a lot of ground. I feel like this new format is successfly as efficient as I hoped it would be. Was there anything else that we didn't get to address that you'd really like to leave my audience with?
No, not really. I think we kind of covered all the bases looking through my notes. It's been
that was good. That was very, very concentrated. Very good. Do you want to tell us a little bit about more immediately what's next for you and Arqadium, and what where people can find you, where you want to send people who are interested in this stuff?
Yeah, so it's mostly just going to be on my blog and Twitter.
There's a link in the description, by the way, folks, if you're listening.
Yes, so I mean, I'm always quite active on Twitter. I probably spend more time online there than anywhere else. but I like to make long form content as well. And ultimately, in terms of things of value that I'm doing, it's going to be the Game Boy games, and it's also going to be stuff like MGBA Net, which is the most recent project I have linked in the description. It's effectively bringing internet to the Game Boy Advance in a hardware compatible way. It's an emulator, so ultimately, like, it'll just end up on Steam, and you just have a game that, this connects to the internet, But I program it on the Game Boy Advance, so that's easy for me. One last thing I would say is just a key quote from my essay, my thesis I wrote, is that with going about computing this way means that I can make a good game for you, and that I can do it quickly, and that you will like the game, and that it won't fall apart next week for either of us. And that means that I can put those on physical copies. I can archive those. You can disassemble those, which is ultimately like where I'm deriving the passion from. When I was a teenager, I got into taking apart the Pokemon games for the Game Boy Advance. That's how I learned about that stuff, So as far as everybody, on the product, I just see it as an absolute win. I think it would be a good thing. We have more of opportunity to share and learn this stuff for what it is.
All right. Awesome. Well, you heard it here, folks. You can, if you're interested in this stuff, you can reach out to Alexander on Twitter. You can also find a link to his blog in the show notes. And yeah, Alexander, I just want to thank you for jumping on here with me and, and presenting a very concise and forceful thesis on, what seems to be an important topic. I think I'm not quite technical enough to be able to match you at the real kind of nerd technical level, but it sounds like you have a compelling vision, and I would love to see you make progress on it.
Yeah, thanks, Justin.
Yeah, you got it, man. All right, well, stay in touch. I think I'll let you go now. I actually have another call in 5 minutes. I actually have to run. So Alexander, you're good to go. Thanks again for coming on, and I'll just do a little outro here. So all right. Thanks everyone for coming through. Big thanks to my patrons. As always, couldn't do it without you. If you are working on creative or intellectual projects, come hang out with us on Tuesday mornings. I do these work sessions. We sit down for 4 hours at a time in a group on Zoom, and we just write, or, we write on our blog. We work on our blogs. Some people are writing books. Some people are doing other kind of creative projects, different types of art projects or whatever. So yeah, it's just, if you're having a problem with being focused and productive during the pandemic, while everyone's like trapped in their house, every Tuesday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, we sit down on a Zoom call. It's fun. Everyone says it makes them more productive. So yeah, if you want to join, it's totally free, completely open to anyone. Bring all your friends. There's a link in the description below. You just have to register. That's all. So yeah, otherwise, what else? Big thanks to the patrons. Please do go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. If you didn't catch all of this and you want to hear the whole talk, it's easier to listen on your phone later, So this will get uploaded to the podcast. It's called Other Life. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts. The only other thing I'll say very briefly is that I'm now kind of back on the weekly live stream horse. So I'm, for fun at the moment, one thing I'm doing is on Friday nights. I'm very sad that I can't drink. I can't go to the bar anymore. I'm not a heavy drinker, but I do like social drinking. Back when civilization was running, I'd go to the bar probably once a week, have at least one beer a week. I just like being around people. I like drinking a little bit, talking some shit. So I really am going rather stir crazy not having that now that everyone's locked in their houses. So I'm doing a little to substitute for that. I'm doing Friday night live streams. I did one last week. I'm gonna stay on this for a few weeks. We'll see how it goes. If it's really fun and people like it and I like it, maybe I'll institute it as a more permanent feature. But I'm doing it tomorrow for sure. So come back here around 7 p.m. for me, which is 2 hours after right now. I'll be back on here tomorrow. So come with a kind of Friday night social vibe, because that's going to be the vibe I'm trying to bring. So yeah, it should be fun. But I'm actually starting to plan these a lith bit more. So through the week, I'm kind of accumulating interesting content to talk about, to do some commentary on. I might do some sort of reaction video type segments. As you can see, as with this podcast I did today, since over the past few weeks, I've been thinking a lot more kind of with greater focus and greater yeah, vision, if you will. I've been trying to really think about the template, the formats that I use, and what I'm really trying to achieve. And so I think you can expect over the next few months, all of my content is going to maybe just become a little bit more planned, a little bit more focused, and hopefully you'll find that to be a little bit more concentrated with interesting, fun, exciting, valuable, whatever you want to call it, actual content. The past year, I did a lot of my blogging and talking and live streaming has been just very meandering, and it's been fun and it's cool, but I'm also, I'm trying to always gradually think about how I can make things a little bit tighter, a little bit better, a little bit more chock full of the stuff that actually you all come out, for. So yeah, I'm constantly working on how to make things better. So yeah, tomorrow's live stream should be fun. Should be a little bit more, focused and I think fun than maybe some of my old whatever streams where I would just kind of fire up the live stream and talk. So yeah, thank you everyone. Please do subscribe if you haven't done so already, and click the bell if you want to get notifications. Otherwise, yeah, big thanks to Alexander. This was fun and I hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you all here tomorrow night or Tuesday morning if you want to come do some work with us. All right, later everybody. Bye-bye.